Thank you, Don. That was very nice. Well, I look forward to getting to know most of you during the day. And the topic that I'm going to try to uncover and take you a little story through is this big buzzword called informal learning. And I think the way I prepared the speech or the talk is really as a little story about what is informal learning, why are we talking about it, what does it mean to your organizations, and what does it mean to you as learning and development professionals. And I'm going to take you through this in about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. So anybody who wants to ask any questions about this or any other topic, I'd love to entertain them. So let's talk about where we are first and why, and I'm going to give you some context as to why this whole topic and this word keeps coming up. By the way, informal learning is really turned into quite an interesting buzzword. It means different things to different people. And as a research organization, we like to try to sort that out and make sense out of it. So one of the ways to do that is to try to look a little bit at why it's even occurring. The first thing that I want to just highlight for you is how many of you work in commercial, profit-making, or attempting to be profit-making organizations? Okay. So how many of you work in the government or a nonprofit? Okay, that's almost the same number of people. I think it was a lot of the same of you. Well, anyway, that's another issue. One of the reasons, and I'll give you a little story here. Businesses are going through accelerating rates of change. And I think if there's anything that CEOs learn this year is that everything that you thought you were going to be able to do in the future, you have to rethink it consistently. And here's the history of this. In 2006, companies told us, about 2/3 of them told us they expected a transformational change to take place in their business. About 57% felt they were ready for those changes, and there was a change gap of 8%. In 2008, it was a change gap of 22%. In 2009, it was a change gap of 29%. This is about 1,000 companies. So that's telling us that 1 out of 3 organizations, the CEO, does not believe that their organization is ready for the changes that are going on right now. And when you ask these CEOs, what is it that's holding you back? Is it access to capital? Is it technology? Is it marketing? Is it globalization? Is it financial regulation, government regulation? The number one issue that comes up is people. We don't have the right people doing the right things and the right jobs to deal with the transformation that's taking place in our industry. Financial services, telecommunications, you can go through every single industry you work with, and you can think of those examples. And we've just been through a recession. And we're probably still in it, or maybe we're coming out of it. And so what's happened as a result of that recession is organizations have cut a lot of sort of overhead staffs, one of those being learning and development. And I'm going to show you some data on this throughout the presentation. Our data from 2009, reflecting on 2008, was that the U.S. and North American industry shrunk by 11%. That's a lot. I mean, it was about a $60 billion industry before this happened. And we looked at the data, we just published the data on 2009, and it shrunk by another 11%. So actually, in the last 2 years, the amount of spending on learning and development in the United States and North America, not in Europe, went down by 22%. Now, we just found out that actually in Europe, that number is different, and I'll show you those numbers later. In addition, look what's happened over the last 5 years. The amount of formal training per employee in North America went down by 56%. That's essentially the number of student hours that North American employees spent in a classroom in front of an instructor. And this one's the scary one, I think, for you. The percent of the learning and development budget that was spent on your salaries of the staff went down by 28%, because people are spending more money on other things. So there's a lot of interesting things that are happening. And that is actually one of the reasons we're talking about informal learning. And here's the context for that. I kind of got into this industry around the year 2000 or so, when there was a big boom in the economy. That was the dot-com economy. I live in California, so I was right in the middle of that. And as I remember, and the word e-learning actually really sort of took off in 1999. I don't know if any, you probably don't track that, but before 1999, everybody wasn't sure what to call this internet-based stuff. And that's all of a sudden the word took off. And at that point in time, the stock market in the United States crashed, And companies basically said, wow, corporate training is going to be completely transformed. We're going to shut down the corporate university. We're going to put it all online. Bricks and mortar training is going to go away. In fact, the public institutions are going to be replaced by online. I don't know if any of you remember that, but that was exactly the dialogue people were having. And it actually was very much accelerated and caused the emergence of the internet-based training industry because of the recession. And I think the recession in 2000, 2001 really accelerated a lot of businesses saying, you know what, we can't send as many people to classroom anymore. We can't do as much travel. We need to cut the amount of time the instructors and the individuals are spending in training. Let's put this stuff online. Now, what happened over the next 10 years is that companies actually found out it's not that easy. It doesn't work as well as you thought it was going to work. A lot of that page-turning content doesn't really teach anybody anything. They might sit through it, but they may not gain any skills from it. We need more interactivity. We need more smaller chunks of content. All those issues have come up over the last 10 years, but we didn't really know that in 2000, 2001 when we launched into that. And that's kind of where we are today, the concepts of blended learning and all the things that you're probably talking about at this conference. Well, here we are again, another one of these recessions. Same thing's happening again. Social networking, mobile phones, the iPad that was just, I don't know how many of you paid attention to that last night. Interesting, new trend. Social networks. Young people entering the workforce who basically would rather text message than do email. I don't know how many of you have children, but my kids would much rather communicate with me on text message than they would sometimes even over the phone. I can't even get them to pick up their cell phones, but I can text message them and I'll get back an instant response. So there's a whole bunch of the same things, very similar, symptomatic to where we were back here, plus a recession that are forcing corporations to say, you know what, there's easier ways of doing this. And I think you had Peter Butler talk to you in one of the sessions about what they're doing at BT, which is a pretty conservative company. They have moved into this in a big way, and a lot of the ROI of what they've done at BT is saving money. It isn't about increased skills, it's about saving money. So that's kind of what's created this. In addition to that, the workforce that we live in has changed. We have a much more connected work environment. We have five generations of workers in the workforce. And we have a lot more mobility, a lot of contractors working, at least in the United States. It's probably true here. We have a lot of temporary workers, probably less true here. But in the United States, where there's a lot of at-will employment, people are basically, we don't need you full-time. We'll let you work a day a week. Sorry, if you want to work here, that's the new deal. And people have to deal with that. So a lot of things have changed that, plus the fact that what really happened during the recession is we sort of delayed the aging of the baby boomers because the baby boomers basically kept working, but they were all planning on retiring. A couple of years from now, they're going to go back to thinking about that again. And a lot of big organizations, especially older companies like oil companies, look like this. This is actually Chevron, a global oil company. This is the frequency, the number of workers in this age versus number of workers with this. This is not age. This is tenure, years of service. And what you can see is they have a massive problem. They have a huge amount of institutionalized knowledge that they have to transfer into this younger population of workers. And they don't know how to do that. Formal training is not going to do it. It's not going to happen. So, this is one of the things that's forcing companies to look for new ways of transferring knowledge. And Chevron needs to do this in order to basically stay in business. The other thing that's happened during the recession is companies have actually come back and said to us, we are more dependent on skills now than we were before. Even though we cut our training budget, even though we may have rationalized the amount of money that we're spending on formal training, now in the end of the recession, the need for skills is higher than ever. This is a report we do every quarter, which we call Talent Watch. It's kind of a business-driven survey of demands for different types of training and different types of talent. And what you can see is, over the last 6 months, right as we came out of the recession, we have an increase, a dramatic increase in the demand for skills, a dramatic increase in the demand for leadership skills, and really the other stuff hasn't really changed that much. So even in the middle of the recession, when people were laying off employees in companies like GM, who we do business with, were threatening to potentially go out of business. They were telling us we still have tremendous skills gaps. So the skills gap problem has not gone away. As a matter of fact, it's even more important than that. Let me show you a little movie. Oh, let me go back here.
We are Intel, sponsors of tomorrow.
Now, I don't know if did that ad play over here? Did you guys see that ad? What's the message in that ad? The message is deep specialization. What they're basically saying, what Intel's basically saying is, our engineers are really the most important people in our company. And I know Intel really well. We work with Intel. Intel is a company that is run by technical experts. You're not going to be a big shot at Intel unless you've designed, developed, or had a major impact on some major piece of technology at Intel. And what they're basically saying, and what's made Intel successful, is the deeper and deeper we are in specialized skills in our industry, the more profitable we're going to be and the more successful we're going to be. And we've seen this in company after company, industry after industry. GE did a study 2 years ago. They looked at the highest performing businesses in GE to try to figure out what the characteristics were of the businesses in GE that were doing very well. And the one thing they found in common is those businesses were run by leaders who had been in those businesses for 7 years or longer. And essentially the finding was, we got to stop moving people around so much. We got to get them to stay where they are and get better and better and better at what they're doing. And even if there is a business transformation, even if there is a massive recession and we have to do things differently, we need very specialized skills in order to make those transitions well. Accenture is going through a massive program right now to recertify and train every single consultant on 6 levels of capability in a whole bunch of different disciplines to build a deeper level of specialization. As they put it, it used to be you could make money in consulting by having smart people and putting them on site and charging people for having them available. And they said, we can't do that anymore. We can't just be smart. We have to be more educated on the topics that our clients need than any other consulting firm in order to compete. And I think that's true in financial services. That's true in manufacturing. That's true in almost every industry. So that's another thing that's actually driving a push towards informal learning. And I'll get to what informal learning is in a minute. I just want to give you a little motivation. Now, the other thing to look at is the context of the training industry. The training industry tends to go through sort of phases. From a technology standpoint, we had a period of time in the early 2000s when everybody was really interested in LMS. And that's continued. And that's moved now into sort of a whole bunch of new learning technologies that we're evaluating. In terms of what we were trying to do, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of focus on content development, building e-learning programs, making them interactive, finding ways of doing blended learning, looking into things like simulations, which are continuing to grow. Now we're starting to talk about collaboration, social learning, rich media, video, mobile technologies. The disciplines. When I got involved in the training industry, and I don't have a background in this industry, I wasn't trained in it, I've really learned about it through the research, the ADDIE model. I worked for a content development firm for 2 years. If you weren't an instructional designer, you were nothing. Everything was about instructional design. The Kirkpatrick model, which we all know a lot about. Rapid e-learning, information versus instruction. I went through many, many months of debate with our instructional designers at the company that I was at about why it's okay to put material out there that isn't instructionally designed if people need it to do their jobs. And they would constantly say to me, no, we can't do that because that's not instructionally sound. And I say, well, I don't care if it's instructionally sound. People need it. We need to put it out there. Well, there's all that kind of debate's been going on. Now we're into a whole new set of topics. And then in terms of the types of problems and the types of environments, we're now looking at career development, specialization, leadership development. So what's really happening is if you total this all up, we're really moving into a new era and a new set of roles. Because all of these things happen little by little, but if you don't look at them as a whole, you don't see this. And that's why informal learning is becoming so big. Why does it matter? The simple reason is that we all know in our gut that the way people learn is not entirely through formal training. If you ask business people, and this chart is actually in your, there's an article that we wrote in your guide if you'd like to read it. We asked a bunch of business people, I think there were 1,100 companies, we asked the business executives, in your company, where do people develop their skills? And they said, on the job. They didn't say by going to the training department. They said through mentoring, through projects. Think about your own career. How did you learn to do what you know how to do? Probably because you had a project or an assignment that was very, very challenging, and you worked your way through it, and at the end of that, you learned a huge amount from that experience. Or you had a boss or a mentor who took you under their wing and said, you know what? You're not actually doing this right. Come over here and let me show you how to do it better. Those are the things that actually really do drive behavior change and skills development in organizations. Formal training is important, but only 28% of the organizations we talked to felt that it was really one of the most important areas of development in their organization. And we have to accept that. And that's just the way the world is. The other thing that we know, and I think probably all of you know this in your gut, is that the way learning actually takes place in an organization, small, big, or enormous, is really through culture. If you send somebody to a training class, one of the research reports I did quite a while ago had to do with transfer of learning and measurement. I talked to a bunch of companies who had sent people to training, and then they went back into the office and tried to do their jobs, and their managers knew nothing about the training, nor did they sponsor the training. So they went back into their work environment and got no reinforcement, no support, no ongoing coaching around that training. And of course what happened is those programs were rated as relatively ineffective. There was nothing wrong with the training program, but the culture wasn't built around it. Now a couple of years ago we did this research. We looked at the the business impact of organizations relative to their culture. And what you found is that the companies that are really driving a lot of business impact out of their training have great learning cultures. They have executive and management and other processes that reinforce learning and go with it. And that is also a part of what informal learning is. I'll explain to you in a minute. When we asked learning and development executives last year what are the topics they wanted us to study as a research organization, the number one thing they said was, how do I improve my own internal learning culture? That's what's on the minds of either your bosses or your executives in your own organizations. Now, how many of you have seen this before? The 70-20-10 model, right? Let me just have a little drink of water here. This is very, very widely, quoted on the internet, and it's actually very intuitively obvious that most people believe that at most formal training will probably be responsible for 10% of your skills. And that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, because there are certain periods of time in anybody's career where formal training will be responsible for a huge percentage of your learning, and then later you will apply it and other things will take over. That's not really the right model for informal learning. This is a nice thing to look at and think about and get yourself motivated, but I don't think it teaches you what you need to do. I think a better model is something like this. If you think about what happens in a formal training program, you start down here as a novice, new to some topic, and you go up the learning curve of experience, basically making mistakes on the job, and then you plateau. And somebody says to you, you know what, you got to go to training. You're not doing it right. So you go to a training class, you have a fantastic experience with an instructor or some type of content, you become very, very aware and ready to go back on the job and do a bunch of things differently. You go back to work, and you end up losing some percentage of it, and you're at a higher level of capability than you were, but you're certainly nowhere near you felt you would be during the class. And I think all of us have probably experienced that in some training activity. The way informal learning really needs to be considered is you're trying to fill this whole thing in. You're trying to build an environment around which people can learn continuously through a whole bunch of different techniques. And there's a lot of these techniques. And I think the way we define informal learning, I'll show you the framework in a minute, is it's really an opportunity for you to just broaden your horizons in the types of activities and resources that you're going to provide to people in your organization to fill in this orange gap. Ideally, this should be an environment, not a series of programs. And that's really kind of the theme here, is that if you can help your organization build a continuous learning environment, some of which, by the way, you're not going to be designing anything. You're just going to be sort of watching it and helping it. That is really what is going to make organizations successful. When I show you some examples, you'll see what I mean. Well, how do we define all this? Well, one of the things we like to try to do as a research organization is we like to draw models. And so here's our model of how to think about informal learning. The traditional approach to training is, I got to build a program. All right, we're rolling out a new product. We're rolling out a new software application. Let's build a training program around it. We had a meeting yesterday with a company that is in the middle of rolling out a big new application. They're going to sit down with Flash, and they're going to build 50 hours of content. And I said to the guy, that's very nice, but what about all the performance support and the other stuff? Oh, well, we'll figure out how to do that later. And I was thinking, all right, okay, we'll talk about that later. But basically, you have a program. You go through a design process. You build on the disciplines that you've learned. You use the tools that are available to you. You have some organization structure, and you have what we call learning architecture. We call learning architecture is essentially the set of tools and techniques that you use in your organization. Every organization has some constrained set of stuff that they use. Not everybody does everything. And that model's been around forever, and that's the way most training is developed. In the informal learning world, you need to think about it a little bit differently. We still have a learning program. We still have formal design. We still have disciplines. We still have tools. We still have this stuff on the outside. But we need to look at the audiences and the environments in which people work. And then we need to look at other experiences that will complement the formal training and how they will reinforce and fill in that orange gap. And we've defined it for the standpoint of just a definition. You can come up with your own, but this is the one that we've come up with after a lot of looking at this. There's essentially 3 types of informal learning. What we call on-demand learning, and I'll show you what that is in a minute. Social learning, where you're learning from other people. And embedded learning. Business processes and practices that don't actually look like training, but they support the learning and development process. The disciplines now are slightly different. The tools and technology are slightly different. And we believe you need to look at culture. And as I'll show you in a minute, one of the things that's different about informal learning is you become dependent upon your organization's culture in order to be effective. And the companies that are really, really figuring out how to do informal learning very, very well are also addressing their own learning culture. So in many ways, they're becoming much better organizations in many ways that's far beyond what goes on in the training department. You can get this chart from us, which is in one of our reports, and this has sort of all the little examples of the things that we think fit into this area. And we've showed this framework. We've had this framework out for about 6 months now. A lot of companies have looked at it and said, let's look at our instructional design process. Let's look at our needs analysis process. Let's look at our performance consulting process. Maybe we can do things a little bit differently to try to design in some of these other types of activities. Now, one of the things, as I said in the very beginning, remember what happened in e-learning in 2000. We figured it was going to replace everything. We're kind of in that stage of informal learning right now, where everybody's thinking, oh, this is going to be completely revolutionary and it's going to change the way we do. Well, that's probably not true. There's a lot of things we don't know about it yet. We know that we need to have communities of practice. We know we need to do these things. What we don't know is, how do we manage these communities? What is our culture? What is the governance of a knowledge-sharing system? Who makes the decisions about what knowledge we share and or do we let it just take care of itself? How does this affect our instructional design? We still have to build formal training. Do we insert social activities within the context of the courses? Companies are now figuring this out. What are the software platforms? A lot of you probably, how many of you have learning management systems in your organizations? How many of you absolutely love your learning management system? Okay, that's what I figured. Well, 2 people raised their hands. There's a revolution going on in the platform business right now. Okay, companies are really struggling to get their arms around what is the right platform that's going to support and facilitate all of this informal type of learning. How do I search and tag things? What is the information architecture? There's a lot of new things that we're going to learn here. And I don't have the answers to all of these, but I do know, as I'll show you at the end, what you should be doing and how you can get yourself really embedded in this. So how does this all work? Well, let me give you a couple of examples, as Don said in the beginning, to really bring this home. And I'll go through the 3 models very briefly and give you a couple of examples of companies in each. Learning on demand. The concept of learning on demand is that rather than try to design an instructional intervention, figure out how people are working today. Where do they go for information? How do they solve problems? And how can you complement the existing patterns of knowledge and activity through formal and informal methods? A really funny example of this is one of the first pieces of research we did in the early 2000s was with a company called Kinko's. Kinko's was a copy centers. There were copy centers all around, and they got bought by Federal Express. And there was a woman at Kinko's who was in charge of corporate training. She was putting together all these training programs. And she was starting to do e-learning, and she was just learning about it. And she was going through her curriculum with me and all the different things they had in there. And she had a course on how to unjam a copier. It was an e-learning course on how to unjam a copier. And I was looking at that, I was thinking, that seems kind of silly. And we talked about it for a little while, and what we realized is they don't need a course on that. They just need a laminated card on the copier, right? Making a course on how to unjam a copier is absolutely insane. You're going to forget everything you learned in the course, and then when the copier jams, you're not going to open the course. So, that's on-demand learning. There's examples of that going on in every single discipline. Here's what HP did when they rolled out a new sales methodology. They didn't send everybody to class for a month to learn how to use it. They built a series of on-demand tools so that a sales rep at HP, who maybe is new or maybe has been through some of the formal training, can immediately go in, determine where they are in the sales process, and click and read what they need to read and go to the next process and go back. Simple, simple system, but quite profound and quite powerful. AT&T has a program that is very widely used in the United States called Business Direct. It's essentially a program where businesses can provision and manage their own phone service. So you're a big company, you have all this AT&T phone stuff. They don't want you calling them every time you want help. They want you to do it yourself. So they built this giant portal of information and tools. Nobody knows how to use it. So they basically built 1,000 little elements in here to allow you to immediately find the answer to a question and solve the problem. It's mostly performance support, but there's also some formal training in there. If you're launching a new product, 2 years ago, Symantec launched an entirely new set of infrastructure for security, enterprise security. They didn't take all of their salespeople and fly them into Cupertino for 3 weeks and train them how to do it. They did a small amount of formal training, but they built a whole library of blogs and wikis and emails that would continuously feed people on-demand help so they would know where to go when they needed support. That's what on-demand learning is. It's very intuitive, very obvious. Social learning. Social learning is really exciting. Everybody's talking about it. There's all sorts of webinars on it. There's all sorts of interesting topics. It really is pretty simple. The concept of social learning is to take the embedded institutionalized knowledge in your company, which, by the way, you don't know it. It's there, but you're not going to have access to all of it, and figure out how to share it. How many of you saw Peter Butler talk about Dare to Share? I won't go through this example. It's a fantastic example. This system was really developed for operational activity. It wasn't developed for strategic training, and it's been extremely effective. A lot of other companies are starting to do this. I've talked to companies that have started to set up this type of a system, and they've come back to me and said, you know what? I don't even think I need my LMS anymore. What I really need is YouTube. If I can just figure out how to create YouTube into my old company, maybe we could have a much better learning environment. This is the one I want to tell you an example of. The Federal Reserve, I don't know what the equivalent agency is in the UK. Federal Reserve is the government agency in the United States that monitors the banking system. And what they do is they basically secretly monitor every commercial bank in the United States, continuously rating them, and then they shut them down very, very secretly. They secretly shut down the banks that are going out of business and either recapitalize them or they take them out of the market. And they never tell anybody that they're doing this because they don't want anybody to know that a bank might be failing. And they're constantly doing this. And the way they do this is they have this examination process where these bank examiners go into the banks, they look at key ratios, they interview people, they look at a lot of statistics, and they know from, whatever it is, 100 years of experience, they can predict when a bank is likely to fail. It turns out that these individuals, these bank examiners, have extremely deep skills. This is a deep specialization problem. This isn't something you can come in a year and figure out how to do. You actually have to have gone through, you have to be trained, you have to be financial professional, you have to understand what the Federal Reserve's policies are and all their tools, and you actually have to have had an apprenticeship having gone through a whole number of bank examination activities with a senior examiner before you're certified to go out to do this. Because if you go out and do one of these things wrong, somebody's going to get in a lot of trouble. Also, they have the same problem as Chevron. They have a bunch of senior bank examiners and a bunch of junior bank examiners and a big gap in the middle. And so they looked at this, and the woman that runs this group, the training group, is very, very bright. And she said, you know what? There's no way we're going to solve this with formal training. We really need a knowledge-sharing coaching solution. And what they built was basically an entire solution and a platform that's very simple that allows a bank examiner to share information online, to coach junior bank examiners. They have a certification process so that at every given, it takes about 6 or 7 years to become a certified bank examiner. Over that 6 or 7 year period, you participate in developmental assignments. By the way, a developmental assignment is what we call an embedded learning activity. It actually usually isn't even in your purview, but it actually is a learning activity. That's what we would call embedded learning. And that's the way they build bank examiners. What they have learned is that culture is a huge part of this. And I think this quote kind of wraps it up. We had to really convince people that sharing knowledge was part of their job and that they're going to get rewarded for sharing knowledge and they're going to get penalized for hoarding knowledge. That's a cultural thing in organizations. We talk to companies all the time. Some companies, the way you get ahead is knowing more than everybody else. That's a knowledge hoarding culture. And so there's a lot of cultural issues here. In this particular case, this is a government agency. And typically in government agencies, it's a bureaucracy, and people don't share knowledge. They had to really go through several years of discussion about culture. They needed to create an executive council of governance to push this through. So there's some new things to do here, but that's an example. Another example of this, Westinghouse, one of the largest operators of nuclear power plants around the world. Same problem. It takes, some number of years to really learn how to be a nuclear plant operator. They wanted to go back and recertify a bunch of their new nuclear plant operators. They built a knowledge-sharing system where people who are running nuclear plants can put information. Oh, by the way, when the pressure relief valve number 42 goes into yellow, you need to tap it 3 times, and it usually will fix itself. Whatever. I don't think that's probably a bad example, but... I've seen these examples all over the place where companies are basically saying, you know what, we don't have to design all this. What we really need to do is design a way for the subject matter experts to communicate with the novices. And that's a different role for you, which I'm going to get into in a minute. One of the ones I want to highlight, I think, is really cool. I was talking to Don about this last night. IBM. So IBM, of course, nobody can replicate what IBM does. They're the biggest technology company in the planet. But they have a knowledge-sharing system. It's very much like a big website. And one of the things you can do at IBM is not only can you get access to a lot of resources and share information and contribute and all that, you can look. There's a directory of people at IBM, and you can look at somebody that you emulate, and you can actually look at what they are reading. So let's suppose you're a salesperson, and there's a guy in your territory or somebody, a senior person, and you really, really want to be like them. Their system is set up so that you can actually look at their profile and get access to all of the things that they are reading and then essentially mimic their behaviors through this informal social learning. And that's, I thought, a very interesting concept. That's sort of a second-order thing that we're going to learn more about as this progresses. Okay, the third area is embedded learning. Embedded learning is all of the talent management, HR, customer-centric business processes that force people in your organization to stop working and think. Okay? Development planning. Does your organization have a good process for development planning? We actually found in our talent management research that one of the most highly correlated practices of very effective organizations in talent management is development planning. Yet, most companies look at development planning as a little box at the bottom of the performance appraisal that says, what courses are you going to take next year? Fill in this box and I'll sign it. And that's all they do. That's actually a very valuable process of embedded learning because it forces people to have conversations about, what do I really need to know to be effective? Well, I'll tell you what you need to know. Well, how do I get that information? Well, let's figure it out. Those kinds of conversations. So there's all sorts of other things that you can do. We know, for example, that companies that have career development models are far more effective than companies that don't. These are the companies that say to employees, manage your own career. I used to work for a company like that. When you say that to an employee, what you're basically saying is, figure it out on your own. We don't really value your career that much. It's up to you to figure out what your career is. That's actually a negative business process from the standpoint of outcomes. The more centralized you try to build a career development strategy, the higher outcomes you get. That's what that data is showing you. And there's millions of examples of companies that do this well. I have a couple of them here. I'll just touch on them quickly. Cisco, who is, Cisco's an interesting company. A very, very dynamic, successful, profitable company in an extremely competitive market. And what Cisco knows is the most important specialized skill in Cisco is sales and marketing. In some sense, what Cisco really is a company that buys technology companies and puts them into an incredibly powerful sales and marketing channel. Most of Cisco's products were not developed by Cisco. Probably 3/4 of them were developed by other companies they acquired. But they know how to sell them, they know how to support them, they know how to market them. And as a result, they've built an incredibly detailed program for developing salespeople, which involves many, many elements of informal learning. And I won't go through it, but it involves gated assessments where you're not allowed to progress the next level of your career unless you sit down in front of a bunch of experts and answer a bunch of questions. Very, very powerful model. Okay? And it's done by role. Another form of embedded learning is coaching. I'll give you an example of that. Computer Associates, $4 billion software company, one of the biggest software companies in the world. Very, very sales-oriented company. Having a lot of problems in sales productivity, a lot of problems in sales turnover. People weren't doing very well in the sales organization. Typically, the reaction to that from most training departments would be, let's do some sales training. Let's get them into a room. Let's teach them how to be better sales managers. They took a completely different model. They decided that what was really the problem in that organization had nothing to do with selling skills, had nothing to do with product skills. They didn't know how it was a coaching problem. The leaders in that organization didn't know how to actually work with their own employees. So they built essentially a very informal learning program to teach the line managers, first-line managers at CA, how to coach their employees. And they actually monitored the coaching process of every manager for about a year to make sure that they learned how to coach their employees. They had a 200 or 300% improvement in productivity, dramatic reduction in turnover. That's an embedded learning type of activity. Okay? So what does all this mean to you? I could go through examples all day, but I want to stop in a minute and answer any questions. Well, there's a couple of big things that are changing. The first is there's some new disciplines here. If you don't know anything about social networking, and you don't know anything about content management, you don't know anything about tagging, do you know what a tag is? How many of you know what a tag means? Okay, well, you guys are on top of that. You know anything about information architecture? Those are some of the new disciplines. What this data is showing you is that the companies that we identified this year, or last year, that are really doing an effective job of informal learning to drive business change, they have somebody who understands the concepts of knowledge management. They have somebody who understands the concepts of information architecture. They know how to measure data. They understand performance consulting. Because a lot of this is performance consulting. A lot of this is figuring out what are the performance problems in the organization that may not necessarily be learning and training related. So that's number one, new disciplines. Number two, new technology. The LMS is not the center of the universe in this world. I don't know what is. There is no universal platform for all this, but you are going to end up with a blog, a wiki, some sort of collaboration software. Some of this will probably be SharePoint run by IT. You'll still need an LMS, but you have a new set of technologies now to play around with. And I think we're going to continually see that change. That's going to go on. There's going to be, I don't know what to do with Twitter, but there's this tool called Yammer that's basically an internal version of Twitter, which allows you to build an internal Twitter network in your company. And I think there's ways you're going to be able to leverage that. So there's going to be a bunch of new technologies. New roles. Some of the companies that are doing informal learning have come up with some very interesting new roles. The concept of a portfolio manager. IBM realized when they started all of their informal learning that the problem that people were having was not building content, but there was too much content. So what they needed to do is they needed to take somebody in the training department that arranged the content in portfolios that were relevant to different job roles. That's not a content development job. That's a portfolio management job. I don't think any of us have been trained in how to do that, but we can certainly learn how to do that. So that's a role. Content management, community manager. So there's some new things here that are going to give you and all of us career opportunities to change the nature of what we do. New reward systems, new policies. As I talked about in the Federal Reserve, sharing is a very important part of informal learning. You're going to have to rate and rank contributions. One of the things we've learned in social learning is you can't be anonymous. One of the things that I think Peter probably talked to you about at BT is how do you enforce the quality of content when it's coming from subject matter experts in your organization? You don't let them post anonymous content. It has their name on it. They're going to be careful about what they put on there. They're going to actually fix it if it's not correct. There's actually a self-policing thing that goes on here. You have to have some policies. You have to get executive support. So there's some new rules and policies that you're going to get involved in. So it's a very I think transformational opportunity for you and for all of us in this industry to take advantage of what's going on. Now, the final point I want to make, and then I'll wrap up and we'll have a couple time for some questions, is what does this mean to you here in the UK? Now, we're going to start spending more time here. We're actually going to do a lot more research in the UK, and we are just about to introduce a UK-specific report called the Corporate Learning Factbook UK edition. So what we've done is we've taken all the data that we have on spending and resource allocation and benchmarking and training, and we've done a completely UK-specific version of that. And I think it'll be out in the next couple of weeks. But there's some interesting things that I noticed. One of the things I noticed is that you guys actually spend more money per learner, significantly more, than in North America. I think that's to me a positive thing. You've managed to maintain, your organizations have managed to maintain a commitment. You are using a lot less e-learning than we're particularly familiar with in the States. I think the reason for that, Don and I were talking about that last night, is that you're physically closer together. It's actually easier for you to meet with people than it might be in the States. You're not as big an adopter of virtual classroom. Most of the bigger organizations I talk to, virtual classrooms have become just like real classrooms. Completely equivalent in terms of capabilities. I talked to a big company a couple weeks ago, a company that actually won one of our Learning Leaders Awards. They did a global rollout of their new channel training, all done on virtual. Nobody got on a plane, went anywhere. Completely globalized it. The effectiveness and the outcomes and the level 2 satisfaction was higher than it was when they did classroom training. So virtual classroom, you have an opportunity to do more there. And all these other things. So I think in many cases, you may be able to get the most benefit out of informal learning of many organizations or many geographies in the world because you maybe haven't adopted as much of these technologies over time. But the bottom line in this whole area is that really the only person and the only people that are really going to make this work is you. Informal learning is nothing more than a word, a series of words. And I think and getting back to sort of what Don talked about, I really believe this is an opportunity for all of us in our professions, as individuals, as organizations, and as a career profession, to really redefine what we do, to add more value, to be more efficient in many ways, to be more business relevant, and to really drive tremendously positive changes in organizations. So thank you very much for your time, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, John. Okay.